This has never happened before. And now, once again, the White House wants to talk to the Russian president. Donald Trump's special envoys, Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner, are heading to Moscow for the 7th time to meet with Vladimir Putin. According to the White House, Trump's envoys aim to present Putin with the peace plan Ukraine and the United States developed in late December. Supposedly, after a preliminary review, the Kremlin wanted to discuss the peace plan directly with the Americans, and allegedly this was the reason for the Oreshnik strike on Lviv. Putin tried to intimidate the West in this way, but it seems he failed. And oddly enough, this is connected to future security guarantees for Ukraine. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Russian Union is preparing its own special envoy, who may also go to Moscow to meet with Putin. With growing calls in Europe to resume dialogue with the Kremlin, there is concern about being excluded from United States-Russia negotiations. At the same time, France and Britain have stated that they are ready to send their troops to Ukraine, but only if the United States of America also supports such a security format. Meanwhile, in London, they found a way to get the hero. In London, they suggested seizing Russian oil tankers and selling that oil, with the proceeds going directly to Kiev. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like this video, leave any comment under this episode, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link is in this video's description. And if you find this episode useful and interesting, at the end of the episode, you can support the work of this YouTube channel with your donation or a paid sponsorship subscription using the links and details provided. The video description says, "Support the channel Alexei Pechi." You can use any format you prefer. I appreciate any support. So let's get started. United States Special Envoy Stephen Witkoff will return to Moscow at the end of January for talks with Vladimir Putin, joined by Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared. This was reported by Bloomberg. During his 7th visit to the Kremlin in the past year, Witkoff intends to present Vladimir Putin with a new version of the peace plan for Ukraine, which, according to the White House, is 90% ready. Although it should be noted that the Kremlin has already received this document and even had time to study it. But instead of responding, Russia struck Lviv with a Hazel missile, after which the wild Russians threatened similar strikes against Europe. Why is Witkoff flying to Moscow again? That's a logical question, so let's not jump to conclusions. Let's lay everything out on the table. The peace plan that Donald Trump's administration has been preparing for over a year still includes a lot of unresolved issues. Among them is the main territorial one. The Kremlin continues to insist on taking control of the entire territory of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Meanwhile, Kiev wants to freeze the front line and create a buffer zone with the withdrawal of both Russian and Ukrainian troops. Moscow also strongly opposes the deployment of NATO troops in Ukraine, who are supposed to become a key element of Western security guarantees. The fate of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe, also remains unclear. Before the full-scale war, it supplied almost 20% of all Ukraine's electricity. Although it seemed that the issue of deploying NATO troops in Ukraine after the ceasefire in Europe had already been resolved. According to the Financial Times, the leaders of all G7 countries except Japan intend to personally urge Donald Trump to provide security guarantees to Ukraine. When they all meet next week at the World Economic Forum in Davos? Without such guarantees, even the leaders of the coalition, primarily France and Britain, are not ready to send their peacekeepers to Ukraine in the event of a peace agreement. So, in fact, in Davos, all the European leaders intend to organize such a group meeting with Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. And finally, to persuade the American president to take the issue of Ukraine's security seriously, without this blind faith in the bloody dictator Vladimir Putin. The European Union fears that Trump's frequent changes of position could seriously ruin the entire peace process. And Britain and France are ready to send their soldiers to Ukraine, but only if Trump supports this initiative, as they say, in writing. And after that, it becomes known that Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner are going to discuss with Vladimir Putin in Moscow the issue of Western security guarantees for Ukraine, which will be finally formalized in Davos during the meeting of Europeans with Trump and Zelensky. That's what they're counting on now. And here a number of experts, including the Atlantic Council, say that in 2026, Russia continues to reject proposals aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. The publication notes a statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, which directly stated that Moscow would not agree to the presence of European troops in Ukraine as part of the proposed post-war security guarantees. They say that Moscow has not changed its approach to peace since Donald Trump returned to the White House, although Putin does not directly refuse the peace process so as not to provoke new sanctions. However, there are many signs that the Kremlin is not ready to seriously engage in diplomatic efforts, and Moscow is not changing its approach to peace. Russia hit Lviv with an Oreshnik missile. Donald Trump's representatives, Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner, met in Paris with Putin's envoy Kirill Dmitriev and discussed a peace proposal with him, including security guarantees for Ukraine. Kirill Dmitriev clearly gave this plan to the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin long ago, and now Witkoff and Kushner are going to Moscow to hear Putin's view in person. And now it can be assumed that the Oreshnik strike could have been the signal to the West by which Putin was showing that he doesn't like the security guarantees the West is ready to provide to Ukraine. As if to say, if Western troops are in Ukraine, then this Oreshnik will supposedly fly towards Europe next. But in this episode, an interesting detail appears. Before discussing anything with the Russian Dmitriev, Witkoff and Kushner spent 2 days negotiating with Zelensky's team and European leaders. The same thing is happening. First, Trump, Zelensky, and the Europeans will meet in Davos, then Witkoff will go to meet Putin. In other words, the trend has changed. Now the Russians are informed about a decision that has already been made. And here's another detail. Remember how I said that Kirill Budanov, the former head of Ukrainian intelligence, was appointed as the head of the office of the President of Ukraine precisely so that he could conduct negotiations like this? It is reported that last week Kirill Budanov stayed in Paris for an extra day. When Zelensky's team had already left, Budanov stayed there for another day to discuss territorial issues and the situation with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant with representatives of the United States. Budanov did not disclose any details. And now Witkoff is flying to Moscow. At the very least, this is something to think about. There is another nuance that may indicate that some agreements are approaching. The countries of the European Union suddenly decided that they also need to create the position of a special representative for negotiations with Russia on Ukraine. Well, like to create their own Stephen Witkoff. The initiative is aimed at preventing a situation where the United States makes a deal with Russia behind Europe's back. Supporters believe a special European Union representative at the negotiations will help defend key positions, including Ukraine's potential NATO membership. There are already candidates for this position. For example, Finland's President Alexander Stubb could become the European Union's special representative. Italy is considering former Prime Minister and ex-European Central Bank head Mario Draghi as a candidate. And here I should note that earlier, the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, and the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgio Meloni, publicly called for opening diplomatic channels of communication with the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Well, for example, Emmanuel Macron insists that the European Union should at least partially participate in the negotiation process between Washington and Moscow, and the Italian Prime Minister supports this point of view. So now Europe is trying to become a direct part of the negotiations. Meanwhile, the British are preparing, following the example of the Americans, to seize Russian oil tankers and then sell that very Russian oil. By the way, 2 tankers are already approaching the English Channel, and that's where the British are planning to seize them. And the money earned from selling the seized Russian oil, the British propose to give to Ukraine as a kind of reparation for the war. I'll leave it at that. Subscribe to the channel, write your opinion and your conclusions about this story in the comments, and don't forget to support this channel with your donation. Of course, if this episode was useful for you, that's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.